Thank you, Mr. Chair. This time, I would like to recognize Mike McCabe, who is the Director of the Midwestern Office of the Council of State Governments, CSG. In that role, he oversees the efforts of an 11-member team that provides research and staff support services to several groups of state officials, including primarily the Midwestern Legislative Conference. Mike is a graduate of Iowa State University, go Cyclones, and he earned his law degree at the University of Illinois, Fighting Illini, maybe not so much. We always enjoy hearing his post-election playback and session preview for the upcoming year. And just on a personal note, Mike's always been a great constant for MEC, but also a constant for state legislators like myself in his role with CSG. When I was a freshman legislator, I got to attend the annual conference. It was in Des Moines at that time, and got to meet Mike for the first time there. And then that continued on when I participated in the BUILD program, and then most recently attending a legislative leaders conference in Arizona. So it's just always great to see a familiar face in Mike. You know, they provide great policy research. They provide new perspectives and an opportunity for legislators to connect with so many peers across the country. So for that, I'm grateful personally to you, Mike, and to everything that CSG does for all of us. So thank you. And please welcome Mike McCabe.
Thank you very much, Representative Carfagna. I really appreciate your nice introduction and kind words. And good morning to one and all. It's certainly a pleasure to see so many of you again. It's been too long since we've been able to gather in person. I'm sure you all feel the same way that I do on that point. I want to say a special word of thanks to Dave and your Michigan colleagues for hosting us here in Grand Rapids. As I mentioned to you earlier this morning, it's been a number of years since I was last here, and I'm just amazed by what I see of your wonderful city. You have much to be proud of. Certainly want to congratulate and thank Susan and the outstanding MEC staff. As you know, you are so well served by them throughout the year on many, many fronts. And as an event planner myself, I am sitting over there this morning just a little bit in awe at what they've done to make this event work in its hybrid format. That is not an easy thing to do. So hats off, Susan, and to your staff as well. So well done. It's always nice to follow Tom too. I enjoy seeing him and listening to his reports. I'm going to shift gears here a little bit this morning. As I always do, my purpose here is to present to you an overview of recent developments in the Midwestern states and a look ahead to what might be coming up in next year's legislative sessions. In doing that, I intend to be very broad and cover a lot of ground rather quickly, perhaps rely on questions that you might have to zero in on anything that you might be interested in. And I kind of look at this as an exercise in providing you context for your own discussions and consideration of the issues I'll deal with on a regular basis, looking a little bit more broadly at the full breadth of issues that are shaping state agendas across the Midwest. So let's see. Tom, I didn't grab the clicker from you. I'm sorry about that. Nope, thank you. So going into 2021, it was obviously the beginning of a new biennium, and that means typically longer legislative sessions in our states. But in a lot of ways, it felt like a continuation of some unfinished business, and that's due primarily to what we all saw with the pandemic last year. It certainly shaped the agendas that legislators across the region were facing going into this year's session. And there were some other sort of background things going on that promised to shape what we saw happening in our states across the region this year. Most notably, I think, was the pending release of the census data that we've since seen in August. Obviously, that triggered an important series of redistricting efforts in our states. I'm going to come to that a little bit later. But I think it also told us something about the region that we all need to know and be aware of. As you probably know, without getting down into the weeds about all of the specific things that were revealed in the census, nationally, at a very general level, what we saw is that Populations in rural areas declined somewhat during the last decade, while they boomed in urban and suburban areas. And both of those trends were true in the Midwest too. In fact, if anything, they were more pronounced. The decline in rural areas in the Midwestern states was more significant in 7 of our states than it was in the nation as a whole. And so that sort of shapes some larger trends that will continue to impact what's going on in our states in the years ahead. It also has a direct impact on some of the issues that our legislators are dealing with on the redistricting front now. And of course, it also means that this region will have a slightly smaller delegation in Congress going forward. We've lost 3 seats across the region, 1 each in our largest states, Illinois, Michigan, and Ohio. On the top of all of that, we were facing a very challenging set of economic circumstances, and that's really where I'm going to start with my overview. Obviously, it's just been a wild ride on the economic front during the last 20 months as the nation struggled to cope with the impact of the coronavirus pandemic. While first and foremost a public health crisis that will long be remembered for its devastating impact on the lives of millions around the world, the pandemic also briefly stopped our economy in its tracks. And though a third quarter rebound in the fall of 2020 following a stunning second quarter contraction helped to right the ship and restore the economy's slow growth trajectory of the previous decade, the new normal, or whatever it is that you call what we're in right now, somehow feels different, I think, than the normal we knew before. We're certainly learning a lot about supply chains, for example, and a storefront or a restaurant without a help wanted sign in the window is a rare exception in many places, especially here in the Midwest. Nevertheless, 2021 has been a much quieter year on the economic front than was 2020, and the economy has until recently grown at a faster rate than it had in the years leading up to the pandemic crash of last spring. But after growing at an annualized rate of 6.7% in the second quarter of this year, real GDP appears to have slowed to a growth rate of just 2% in the third quarter based on preliminary estimates released by the BEA just 2 weeks ago. At the same time, the US unemployment rate dropped a fraction of a point to 4.6% in October as employers added more than 500,000 jobs last month, well above anticipated increases for the period. Here in the Midwest, every state in the MEC region posted GDP gains during the second quarter this year, ranging from a low of 2.9% in Nebraska to a high of 8.3% here in Michigan, with 4 states, Illinois, Iowa, Michigan, and Missouri, outpacing the national rate of 6.7%. The Great Lakes states as a group fared slightly better than did the Plains states, with growth ranging from 5.2% in Ohio to, as I said, a high here in the region, here in Michigan of 8.3%. Through September, state by state unemployment rates ranged from a regional and national low of just 2% in Nebraska, national low, shout out to Nebraska, to a regional high of 6.8% in Illinois, with 10 of the 12 MEC states, that's all but Illinois and Ohio, posting unemployment rates below the national rate of 4.6% that was released by the Department of Labor last Friday. It's also worth noting that compared to a year ago at this time, unemployment has declined in every state in the nation and significantly in many. All things considered, the economy is in better shape today than many feared it would be at this time last year, but we're certainly not out of the woods yet. It's been a similar story on the fiscal front, where the states collectively find themselves in far better shape today than we had any reason to expect they would be just one short year ago. Some might say that states are actually swimming in, they're awash in money right now, thanks to a huge influx of federal funds, and I'll come to that in a moment as well. If anything, the challenge right now is what to do with it and how to deploy those resources. But first, stepping back, immediately following the pandemic-induced economic crash in the spring of last year, state revenue collections also hit the wall. And as fiscal year 2020 ended, the outlook for the future was dismal, to say the least, with aggregate state budget deficits expected to soar into the high hundreds of billions of dollars by the end of fiscal year 21. It's hard to believe that that's what we were looking at, that's what we were anticipating as recently as a year ago. As the economy began to recover last fall, so too did the state fiscal forecast, but it really wasn't until Congress approved and the president signed the American Rescue Plan Act in March of this year that the outlook took a dramatic turn for the better. Thanks largely to that the initial influx of federal stimulus dollars and the promise of additional relief under ARP, state revenue forecasts improved significantly this year, and the aggregate decline in revenues states posted in 2020 was ultimately followed by modest growth in FY21, with additional growth of as much as 3.4% anticipated in FY22. On the expense side of the ledger, state spending continued to grow during the pandemic, driven in part by a large increase in Medicaid expenses and demands for other emergency services. In the end, however, only a dozen states nationwide were forced to cut previously approved budgets in fiscal year 21. And while a number of states tapped rainy day funds and other reserves in order to make ends meet, cumulative state fund balances dropped only slightly in FY20 before recovering a bit in FY21. And they remained significantly higher going into the current fiscal year than they were following the Great Recession in 2009, which means in a nutshell that the states are actually in far better shape right now, far better able to withstand the next set of challenges that might come our way. So even coming out of the pandemic, the states are in relatively good fiscal shape at the moment, especially considering where we thought they might be just a year ago. That isn't to say that there aren't challenges ahead, and it's important that we don't lose sight of those. To name one, state revenue growth, while encouraging, still lags pre-pandemic projections in most states. And it's worth noting that it took the states more than a decade to fully recover from the last economic downturn. Also, states that become too reliant on federal relief funds may face a new set of issues once those resources are depleted, and at some point they will be. And any resurgence in the pandemic or another economic downturn could certainly change the math completely. Next, let's turn to this year's legislative sessions, which were significantly impacted again this year, as I mentioned, by the continuing pandemic and efforts to address a wide array of COVID-related concerns. Lawmakers also tackled a number of other issues that emerged on legislative agendas in multiple states. And the delayed arrival of 2020 census numbers in August finally triggered the beginning of redistricting efforts across the region. Let's take a look at some of the key issues and concerns that eventually had the greatest impact on this year's session. And I'm going to focus in a little bit more detail on these four. Nothing special about them, but they encompass a lot of issues that occurred at the top of legislative agendas across the Midwest. So I start, and then some others, and I'll move through those a little bit more quickly. First, the pandemic response. The COVID-19 pandemic remained center stage when the 2021 legislative sessions began last January. And before they ended, virtually every state in the region addressed the continuing crisis in some fashion, with most considering or passing multiple pieces of COVID-related legislation. A small sampling of the measures taken up this year illustrates the wide range of pandemic-related issues that captured the attention of the region's legislatures. In Ohio, for example, lawmakers approved a measure to halt foreclosures and the eviction of residential and commercial tenants during the COVID state of emergency, while the North Dakota legislature passed measures allowing pharmacists to administer COVID vaccine shots, providing occupational licensing flexibility for the duration of the pandemic, and allowing the distribution of per pupil payments to school districts for students receiving virtual instruction. North Dakota and Missouri were just two of many states across the country to pass measures shielding healthcare providers and other businesses from potential liability for exposure to COVID-19, absent reckless or willful misconduct on the part of such businesses. And of course, mask and vaccine mandates were the subject of considerable debate in many of our states and continue to be the subject as well. Needless to say, we haven't seen the end of any of these issues. And as the pandemic continues, states are likely to continue working to contain the public health crisis while shoring up the economy at the same time. Oops. Police and criminal justice reform. That's a big one. The wave of legislative efforts to address a variety of criminal justice reforms and other social justice issues that was triggered by last year's tragic killing of George Floyd continued this year, with Minnesota and Illinois among the first states in the region to enact comprehensive reform packages that included such things as the elimination of cash bail, the required use of body cameras, the expungement of criminal convictions, the limitations on the use of no-knock warrants, and so forth. Since then, several other states across the region have followed suit, with many such efforts focusing primarily on policing. In Indiana, for example, a police reform bill that won broad bipartisan support required police officers to wear body cameras, regulated the use of chokeholds by officers, required de-escalation training to be included in the police academy curriculum, and overhauled the police decertification process, all in an effort to weed out rogue officers. Another sweeping series of reforms was introduced here in Michigan last spring, including a proposal that would establish an affirmative duty for officers to step in and prevent the use of excessive force by other officers. That measure and others are still pending. And Missouri passed a reform bill banning the use of chokeholds. A special commission on police reform and racial equity in Kansas issued a series of recommendations that led to the introduction of 10 proposed measures in that state this year, only one of which, a requirement for training on missing and murdered Indigenous people, eventually passed the legislature. At the same time, measures to protect police were considered in other states across the region. For example, here, in Iowa, lawmakers passed a bill called the Back the Blue Act, which cements a police officer's right to qualified immunity in statute. Elections and voting, another big one, again, across the region in many of our states. In the wake of last year's elections, proposed election reforms were introduced by the hundreds in states across the country. Some, as you've heard, were designed to make voting easier and to encourage early voting, mail-in balloting, and the early counting of ballots received before Election Day. Others imposed new limits and restrictions on voting or pre and post-election preparations and follow-up work, presumably to protect the integrity and the security of elections. For instance, a new measure enacted over a gubernatorial veto in Kansas limits early voting and makes it illegal for Kansans to return more than 10 advance ballots on behalf of other voters. Similarly, a new Iowa law shortens the voter registration period before elections and requires polls to close earlier on Election Day, while a measure enacted in North Dakota would shorten the deadline for post-election work by county canvassing boards. Other election-related measures approved across the region this year included an Ohio bill clearing the way for the election of appellate judges and Supreme Court justices in partisan elections. Interestingly, Ohio, prior to that bill, was the only state in the country in which top judges were elected in partisan primaries, but nonpartisan general elections. So that's going to change in Ohio. An Illinois measure delaying next year's primary election from March until June, and another bill transitioning the Chicago Board of Education from a 7-member mayor-appointed board to a fully elected 21-member body by 2027 also passed this year. And finally, neither a legislatively ordered audit conducted by the Nonpartisan Legislative Audit Bureau, nor an independent investigation commissioned by the Speaker and conducted by a former Supreme Court justice turned up any evidence of large-scale vote fraud during last year's elections in Wisconsin. Redistricting, another big one, as I mentioned. By this fall, states across the country finally turned their attention to the business of redistricting following the delayed release of new census data at summer's end. Here in the Midwest, several states have already completed the process following special sessions to approve new maps, in Iowa and Nebraska, for instance. And others, like both North Dakota and South Dakota, went into special session just this week for the same purpose. By contrast, the process is off to a slower start or likely to become much more contentious in some of the region's divided government states, places like Kansas, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, where final decisions may ultimately be made by courts as a result of litigation and so forth. 3 other states in the region with new or unique processes are especially worth noting, I think, especially since redistricting doesn't come around very often. It's always an interesting time. In Iowa, they have a unique process on the books under which maps are initially prepared by the Nonpartisan Legislative Service Agency and can only be voted up or down by the legislature without amendment when they're first presented to the floor. After a couple of tries, if that doesn't work, then there's a process by which the court can intervene. And during the 4 cycles that this process has been in place, legislature has always managed to pass one of the first couple of maps. This year, the first map was rejected by the legislature, and there was some uncertainty for a while as to what the fate of the second one would be. But just a couple days before Halloween, the second map finally was approved on October 28th. Here in Michigan, the process of redistricting is being handled for the first time this year by a new independent citizen-led commission. A new set of map was released for review and comment just last Friday after the commission's first maps drew heavy criticism earlier this fall, and that process obviously is still ongoing. In Ohio, the state's still new redistricting commission recently approved a new map that did not win broad bipartisan support. As a result, under the commission's rules, the new map will only be effective for the next 4 years instead of the next full decade, providing the outcome of litigation challenging the fairness of the new scheme doesn't change things. So we'll keep an eye on what happens in Ohio. As I mentioned, there were a number of other issues, of course, that captured the attention of legislatures around the region. I'll start to pick up my pace and go through these a little bit more quickly, but there certainly are several worth note. Budget and taxes, a perennial issue everywhere, perhaps a little bit more challenging this year than in the past, given some of the economic and fiscal circumstances I described earlier. It shouldn't be surprising that all of our states had significant pieces of legislation in this area. Iowa, Ohio, Nebraska, and Wisconsin were 4 of 11 states nationwide to cut personal income and/or corporate income tax rates by the summer of this year. The Iowa and Ohio changes also included the consolidation of tax brackets. A measure imposing sales taxes on goods sold online while reducing other taxes by as much as $130 million was enacted over the governor's veto in Kansas. New tax exemptions and credits benefiting coal-fired power plants on the one hand and veterans on the other were approved in the state of North Dakota this year. And Missouri lawmakers passed a bill to raise the nation's second lowest gas tax by 12.5 cents per gallon over the next 5 years. Legislative oversight. This is an issue I touched on in great when I reported to you last year. That's my shorthand, I guess, for the ongoing tug of war legislatures across the region and indeed across the nation, primarily with respect to the exercise of emergency powers by governors and the desire on the part of legislatures to contain that exercise. Efforts by legislatures to limit emergency powers of the governors were considered or enacted again this year in several of our states in the Midwest, including in Indiana and Kansas, where a measure rewriting the state's emergency management law won bipartisan support following the extended negotiations between the governor and the legislature. And in North Dakota as well, where a bill specifying the required approvals for the disbursement of federal funds was finally approved by lawmakers. Social issues remained hot button items on a number of legislative agendas again this year. Just to mention 2, a number of our states tackled abortion rights in one way or another, proposed constitutional amendments potentially limiting the right to abortions advanced and will ultimately be submitted to voters for approval in Iowa and Kansas. And then several other states took up the issue surrounding the ability of transgender athletes to compete in school sports. They were considered or are still pending in several states around the region and are likely to recur again next year based on preliminary intel from some of those states. Broadband access was identified as a high priority in a number of our states, especially after what we saw during the pandemic when people had to find new ways of working and new ways of attending school. So it shouldn't be a surprise that a number of our states were focusing on that again this year. Nebraska, North Dakota, and Ohio were just 3 of many states across the country to approve measures designed to improve access to broadband service. Ohio pumped additional funding into several initiatives this year to ensure the safety of clean water and also to shore up the state's water infrastructure. Illinois passed a comprehensive clean energy bill, committing the state to an ambitious set of carbon-free emission goals by 2050. And gun restrictions of one kind or another were eased in several states, including Kansas and Missouri. Of course, there were many more, and I'm not going to go through the rest of the list, but just know that there's more out there, and I'm only scratching the surface. I will, however, make a couple of important transitions that I think were noteworthy this year in my news and notes category, if you will. A couple of these transitions are the kinds of things that I think are worth mentioning because of the important roles that people play in our respective states. In Illinois, for example, the nation's longest serving legislative leader, House Speaker Michael Madigan, who had served in that role for 35 years, stepped down earlier this year. We also saw early departures of the top Senate leaders in both caucuses in the state of Minnesota. We actually saw individual members expelled from 2 of our legislative bodies this year. That does not happen very often. And we've seen a potential impeachment surface of a sitting attorney general in one of our states. That's being considered during one of the special sessions in South Dakota, probably as soon as this week. Looking ahead briefly for 2022, here again, the list of possibilities is long. I'm not going to go through the entire list of issues that may be taken up by lawmakers next year. But certainly the top 3 on this list that you see on this slide are going to be addressed in many of our states again next year. This is kind of a reflection of what was happening this year, what is left unfinished as this year's sessions end. But the pandemic response, debates over various mandates of vaccines and masks will continue to be the subject of legislative efforts next year. Budgets and taxes everywhere, it's always a perennial issue, but with states trying to resolve issues related to the deployment of federal stimulus funds under the Rescue Plan Act, you can count on that being a hot topic. Criminal justice and policing will remain high priority in many of our states. School funding, school choice is going to resurface as it does on a perennial basis as well. As I mentioned, a couple of these abortion issues have already been set up for future consideration by voters in states through proposed constitutional amendments, and other states are likely to take up the issue legislatively next year. I think we'll see a couple of states focus on medical marijuana again. Elections and voting, for all the reasons I just mentioned in my recap of 2021, will remain a high priority going into another election cycle. Some of our states are still working to fund pensions more adequately than they have in the past. That'll remain a high priority in a couple of places. I think you'll see some interesting energy initiatives, and then several others. I've just mentioned a few in passing: occupational license, infrastructure, human trafficking, sports betting. These are among several more that I think will rise to the top of agendas this year. Finally, let's take a quick look at the political front as we head into election year 2022. As a reminder, the partisan landscape across the Midwest did not change much in last year's elections. There were actually no partisan swings of control at all in this region, which is unusual. Neither were there any changes in the partisan control of governorships in the region, since there were only 3 gubernatorial races. All 3 saw incumbent Republicans easily reelected. And so going into 2022, Republicans still control unified control of state government in 6 of the region's 12 states, 7 if you include Nebraska. Democrats control state government in just 1 state, that's Illinois. You'll see this reflected on this map. Republicans still control 19 of 22 partisan legislative chambers across the region and more than 60% of all legislative seats in the region. Minnesota, by the way, remains the nation's only divided legislature, which is also an unusual departure from the norm for many, many decades. So what's at stake in 2022? This is just a list of the current incumbent governors. You know them, and another way of illustrating the partisan composition of the legislative chambers. Going into 2022, we will see gubernatorial races in 36 states, including 9 of the 12 here in the Midwest. That's everybody, all of the states except Indiana, Missouri, and North Dakota. Incumbents are running or expected to run in 8 of those 9 states. The only one that isn't is Nebraska Governor Ricketts, because he's term limited out. The 8 that are likely to seek re-election include 5 Democrats and 3 Republicans. We'll also see legislative races across the country in 44 states this year, including some or all of the seats in every Midwestern legislative chamber. So a big year on the election front for state legislatures. A number of ballot measures are already surfacing. Only a handful have actually been certified for the ballot at this point, but it's something to keep an eye on as we go into 2022. And I'm sure by this time next year, I'll be able to fill you in on what happens with those ballot measures. It's always an interesting angle added to the election mix each year. So that completes my recap of the session past and a quick peek ahead to the coming session. I just want to close by saying thank you again to all of you. I always look forward to being with you in these meetings. Thank you, Susan, to you and your staff. Congratulations on a great event. Hope you'll all think about joining us for the annual meeting of the Midwestern Legislative Conference next summer. Very much.